A quick note before we begin. This presentation is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or financial advice. The laws surrounding online gambling are incredibly complex, constantly changing, and vary dramatically from state to state. Always consult with a qualified legal or financial professional for guidance specific to your own situation. He was a 30-something-year-old options trader from San Francisco, a numbers guy. And in 1996, standing at the dawn of the commercial internet, Jay Cohen saw the future. He saw millions of people getting online, and he knew what they'd want to do: bet on sports. The problem? In the United States, that was for the most part illegal. The solution? He packed his bags, left California, and moved to the tiny Caribbean island of Antigua. This was the Wild West era of the internet, a digital frontier with no rules, no sheriffs, and unlimited potential. In Antigua, a country that was actively encouraging online gaming businesses, Cohen and his partners launched the World Sports Exchange. It was a simple, brilliant concept: a secure, reliable website where Americans could legally place bets on their favorite teams. They weren't hiding. They were licensed by the Antiguan government. They paid Antiguan taxes. From their perspective, they were running a legitimate international business, using the new global network called the Internet to serve willing customers back home. And business was booming. Money was pouring in. They were pioneers, proving a concept that would one day become a multi-billion-dollar industry. But back in the United States, the Department of Justice saw things very, very differently. They didn't see a pioneer. They saw a criminal. They saw an American citizen using new technology to sidestep old laws. And they decided to make an example of him. In 1998, U.S. Attorney Mary Jo White unsealed a federal indictment. Jay Cohen and a dozen other offshore bookmakers were charged with conspiracy, accused of violating a dusty, decades-old piece of legislation called the Federal Wire Act of 1961. Most of the other operators stayed safely in their Caribbean havens, beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. But Jay Cohen did something no one expected. He believed he had broken no U.S. law. He believed the government was fundamentally misinterpreting a law written for the mafia to apply to the internet. So he bought a plane ticket, flew back to New York, and turned himself in to the FBI. He was determined to fight. He was convinced he would win. This one man's decision to stand trial would become the first great legal battle over the future of online gambling in America. It was a showdown that pitted a pre-digital law against a post-digital world. A law written to stop mobsters from using telephone lines to fix horse races was now being aimed at a guy in Antigua, taking a $50 bet on the Dallas Cowboys over a fiber optic cable. Did it apply? Could it apply? The answer to that question would shape the next 25 years of internet history, and it's the reason why, even today, the simple act of betting on your phone is a legal minefield of confusing, contradictory, and often infuriating rules. Have you ever wondered why you can use one betting app in New Jersey, but the moment you cross the river into New York, it suddenly stops working? Or why you can play online poker in Pennsylvania, but not in Ohio? Have you ever had a credit card deposit declined on a gaming site, with no real explanation? The answers to all of these questions don't start with an app. They don't start with a Supreme Court decision in 2018. They start right here in the legal chaos of the late 90s, and with laws that were passed long before the first computer was ever plugged into a phone jack. This is not just a history lesson. Understanding this story is the key to understanding the money and power that controls a $100 billion American industry. It's about how the government, massive corporations, and even your own state legislature decide what you are and are not allowed to do with your own money in the digital world. Over the next 10 parts, we are going to unravel this entire tangled history. We will put you in the room with the lawmakers, the lobbyists, the tech pioneers, and the gamblers who fought these battles. We'll expose the backroom deals, the shocking court rulings, and the technological loopholes that created the system we have today. By the end of this series, you won't just know the history. You will finally understand why the American online gambling landscape looks the way it does, and you'll be able to navigate it with a clarity you've never had before. The Jay Cohen case was the flashpoint, the moment the US government drew a line in the digital sand. But to truly understand the weapon they used against him, the Wire Act, we can't start in 1996. We have to go back further. We have to go back to a time of black and white televisions, smoke-filled back rooms, and a charismatic young president. We have to go back to 1961, to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and his all-out war on a different kind of empire, organized crime. Because the story of online gambling in the 21st century is impossible to understand without first understanding the mob's iron grip on illegal betting in the 20th century. Before there were servers in Antigua, there were bookies in Boston. Before there were digital wallets, there were bags of cash. And before the Department of Justice went after tech entrepreneurs, they were hunting some of the most powerful and dangerous crime families in American history. It was in that epic struggle that the legal DNA of our modern online world was first forged. To understand this war, you have to understand the two men who declared it: John F. Kennedy, the charismatic new president, and his younger brother, Robert. As Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy wasn't just a cabinet member. He was the president's enforcer, his bulldog. And he had a list. At the very top of that list was organized crime. For the Kennedys, this wasn't just policy. It was personal. Their own father, Joseph Kennedy, had his own rumored ties to the underworld during Prohibition. But for the new generation, the mob represented a shadow government, a corrupting force that had infiltrated unions, businesses, and even politics. They saw it as a direct threat to American democracy. The mob, for their part, felt betrayed. Legends persist that powerful figures in the Chicago outfit had helped swing the razor-thin 1960 election for JFK, pulling strings in Illinois. They expected a president who would look the other way. Instead, they got a crusader. The Kennedys launched an unprecedented assault on the mafia's operations, tripling the number of convictions in just a few years. But they quickly realized they were fighting a hydra. Every time they cut off one head, two more grew back. The mob's power wasn't just in loan sharking or extortion. It was in the endless, gushing river of cash that flowed from its biggest enterprise: illegal gambling. Specifically, sports betting. In the pre-Super Bowl era, this was a massive, nationwide industry run almost exclusively by organized crime. From a corner bookie in Brooklyn to a high roller in Beverly Hills, the entire network was connected. And the technology that made it all possible was the humble telephone. A bookie in New York could take a bet, then call a central office in Chicago to lay off some of the risk, balancing his books. This information, betting lines, odds, results, crisscrossed the country in a constant hum over telephone wires. It was the mob's nervous system. It was fast, efficient, and almost impossible for local police to track because it jumped across state lines, creating a jurisdictional nightmare. Bobby Kennedy knew that to kill the monster, he had to starve it. He needed a weapon that could sever that nervous system, a federal law that could attack the very infrastructure the mob relied on. He needed to make the simple act of picking up a telephone to place a bet a federal crime. And so, in 1961, the Kennedy administration championed a piece of legislation that would echo through history in ways no one could have possibly imagined. It was called the Interstate Wire Act. On the surface, it seemed simple, almost surgical. The key passage of the law made it illegal for anyone in the business of betting or wagering to knowingly use a wire communication facility to transmit bets or information assisting in the placing of bets across state or national borders. Let's break that down. Wire communication facility. In 1961, that meant one thing: the telephone and the telegraph, the copper wires that connected the country. The law was aimed squarely at the bookie using his rotary phone to call his boss in another state. The second key phrase: in the business of betting. This was crucial. The law wasn't designed to go after the guy making a $5 bet on the Yankees with his brother-in-law. It was aimed at the professionals, the organizations, the syndicates. It gave the FBI the authority to do what local cops couldn't: listen in. With a federal warrant, they could tap the phones, trace the calls, and map out the entire criminal conspiracy from the street-level bookie to the don sitting in his social club. The bill sailed through Congress with overwhelming support. Who would vote against a bill designed to fight the mafia? On September 13, 1961, President John F. Kennedy signed the Wire Act into law. For the mob, it was a declaration of total war. For the Department of Justice, it was like being handed a brand new sniper rifle in the middle of a knife fight. Almost immediately, FBI agents, armed with the new law, began a series of high-profile raids across the country. They kicked down doors in Boston, Chicago, and Las Vegas, armed not just with guns, but with court orders allowing them to seize phone records and recording equipment. The effect was chilling. The mob's communication network, once their greatest strength, was now their greatest vulnerability. Every phone call was a potential piece of evidence. The constant flow of information that had made their sports betting empire so profitable suddenly slowed to a trickle. Bookies became paranoid. The old ways of doing business were now fraught with federal risk. The Wire Act didn't kill illegal sports betting, of course. Nothing could. But it wounded it badly. It forced the syndicates deeper underground and disrupted the river of cash that funded their other operations. For Bobby Kennedy, it was a major victory in his personal war. But here is where our story takes its first critical turn into the unforeseen. The men who wrote the Wire Act were children of the 1930s and 40s. Their technological world was one of vacuum tubes, switchboard operators, and Bakelite telephones. They crafted a law with surgical precision to combat a specific threat, using the language of their time. Wire communication facility. They were thinking of a physical copper cable stretching from one city to another. They had absolutely no concept of a world without wires. They couldn't imagine a global network of interconnected computers, where information could be bounced off a satellite in seconds. They couldn't fathom a device you could hold in your hand that had more computing power than all of NASA in 1961. The internet was not even a fantasy. It was a scientific impossibility. And so, the Wire Act of 1961, forged in the heat of the Kennedy War on the Mafia, became a kind of legal time capsule. It was a law written for an analog world. After its initial success in the 60s and 70s, it became less central to the fight against organized crime, as the mob's power began to wane for other reasons. The law sat on the books, a relic of a bygone era, like an old sword hanging on a wall. Most lawyers barely knew it existed. It was a sleeping giant. For decades it slumbered. The world changed around it. The first email was sent. The personal computer was born. A network originally designed by the military to survive a nuclear attack began to connect universities, and then homes. This new world, this digital frontier, was a place of boundless optimism and, crucially, almost no rules. It was a Wild West built not on dusty plains, but on lines of code and fiber optic cables. And in this new, unregulated space, entrepreneurs saw an opportunity. They saw a way to offer something that had previously been confined to the back rooms of bars and the glittering casinos of Las Vegas. They saw a way to bring the poker table, the slot machine, and the sportsbook not just into every state but into every single home. They were about to build a multi-billion-dollar empire in cyberspace. And they had no idea that their biggest legal threat wasn't some new high-tech piece of legislation, but a dusty old law, passed 30 years earlier, designed to stop a gangster named Tony from calling his bookie in Chicago. The sleeping giant was about to wake up. And when it did, it would find that the wire communication facilities it was written to govern had evolved into something its creators could never have dreamed of. The stage was set for a collision between the 20th century's law and the 21st century's technology, a battle that would be fought in courtrooms, in Congress, and on the computer screens of millions of Americans. And on those screens, a new kind of gold rush was happening. Fortunes were being made, not in the dusty hills of California, but in the air-conditioned server rooms of the Caribbean. For entrepreneurs like Jay Cohen, a former stock trader from California, the internet wasn't just a new technology, it was a new frontier. He saw the demand, he saw the inefficiency of the old Las Vegas model, and he built one of the very first online sportsbooks, World Sports Exchange, setting up shop in the friendly, regulation-light island of Antigua. From his perspective, he was simply an innovator, a classic American capitalist finding a new market. He was operating a business that was fully licensed and legal in the country where it was based. The problem was, his customers weren't in Antigua. They were in Akron, Ohio, Phoenix, Arizona, and Boise, Idaho. And the United States government was starting to notice. The central weapon in the government's early arsenal was a law that felt like a relic from a bygone era. The Federal Wire Act of 1961. Think about that. 1961. John F. Kennedy was president. The space race was just beginning. The law was written to combat organized crime, specifically the mob, who were using telephone lines to take illegal sports bets across state lines. It explicitly banned the use of a wire communication facility for transmitting bets on any sporting event. Now fast forward to the 1990s, the Department of Justice looked at the internet, this sprawling global network of data, and made a simple but profound declaration. The internet is a wire. Your computer's modem? It uses a phone line, a wire. Therefore, according to them, the Wire Act applied to the internet just as it did to a rotary phone in a mobster's back room. This interpretation was, to put it mildly, controversial. The pioneers of online gambling argued this was a ridiculous stretch. The law was designed for sports betting, not for the casino games that were now popping up online like blackjack and poker. And it was certainly never intended to regulate a global communication network that didn't even exist in 1961. It was like trying to apply horse and buggy traffic laws to a highway full of Teslas. But for a growing number of politicians in Washington, this legal ambiguity was a threat that needed to be stamped out. Leading the charge was an Arizona senator named John Keel. Keel was a staunch conservative, a man who saw online gambling not as a technological innovation, but as a moral contagion. He believed it brought the casino into the family living room, making it accessible to children and fueling addiction. To him, the internet wasn't a new frontier of freedom. It was an unregulated pipeline for vice, flowing directly into American homes. And he was determined to turn off the tap. In 1997, Keel introduced the Internet Gambling Prohibition Act, or IGPA. It was a blunt instrument. The bill aimed to explicitly make it illegal for any business to offer online bets to Americans, and it would even criminalize the act of placing a bet itself. The bill set off a firestorm. On one side, you had a powerful coalition of forces supporting Keel: religious groups, family values organizations, and perhaps most surprisingly, the powerful brick-and-mortar casino industry. Traditional casinos, represented by lobbyists like Frank Fahrenkopf of the American Gaming Association, were terrified of the online competition. They had spent billions on physical resorts, on licenses, on state taxes. They saw these offshore sites as pirates, operating with no overhead, no regulations, and stealing their customers. They threw their considerable political weight behind Keel's efforts. On the other side were the offshore operators, a burgeoning collection of tech libertarians, and civil liberties groups like the ACLU. They argued that Keel's bill was an assault on personal freedom. If an adult wanted to play a hand of poker online in the privacy of their own home, who was the government to stop them? They also argued it was a classic case of American overreach, trying to impose U.S. law on legal businesses operating in sovereign nations like Antigua or Costa Rica. The debate raged in Congress. For a while, it looked like Keel's bill might actually pass. It cleared the Senate, but ultimately stalled in the House. The dot-com boom was in full swing, and there was a general reluctance in Washington to pass any laws that might stifle the growth of the internet. The first major legislative battle had ended in a stalemate, but the Department of Justice wasn't waiting for Congress to act. Under Attorney General Janet Reno, they decided to go on the offensive, using the old 1961 Wire Act as their sword. In 1998, they fired a shot across the bow that echoed from Wall Street to the Caribbean. They issued indictments against 14 individuals involved in the offshore sports betting industry, charging them with conspiracy to violate the Wire Act. This was a game changer. It was no longer a theoretical legal debate. Federal prison time was now on the table. Most of the indicted operators were American citizens living abroad. They were now fugitives. If they ever set foot on U.S. soil again, they would be arrested. They were trapped in their tropical paradises, unable to come home for weddings, for funerals, for the birth of a child. Most of them chose to remain fugitives. But one man didn't. Jay Cohen, the founder of World Sports Exchange, made a decision that would turn him into the central figure in the first great legal war over online gambling. He believed he had done nothing wrong. He was running a legal license business. He believed the U.S. government was misinterpreting the law and bullying its own citizens. So, he got on a plane, flew back to the United States, and turned himself in. He was determined to fight the charges in court and prove his innocence. His trial, United States versus Cohen, became the ultimate test case. The entire industry watched, holding its breath. Cohen's defense team made a simple, logical argument. The Wire Act was passed to stop sports betting. His company, while it took sports bets, also ran an online casino. The government had no right to prosecute him for the casino games, as they weren't covered by the law. More importantly, they argued the law was never meant to apply to a business legally operating in another country. How could the United States prosecute someone for an activity that was perfectly legal in the place where it occurred? The prosecution's case was even simpler. A bet is a bet. A wire is a wire. Cohen was an American citizen, his customers were Americans, and he was using U.S. communications infrastructure to facilitate illegal gambling. In the government's eyes, the fact that his servers were in Antigua was just a technicality, a cynical attempt to circumvent American law. The jury was faced with a fascinating question. Does a law from the age of telegrams apply to the age of the internet? In February of 2000, they delivered their verdict. Guilty. Jay Cohen was convicted on all counts and later sentenced to 21 months in federal prison. The verdict sent a seismic shock through the online gambling world. The U.S. government had proven it could, and would, reach across borders to prosecute its own citizens. It established a chilling precedent. The legal gray area that these companies had been operating in suddenly looked a lot less gray, and a lot more like a legal minefield. Many American founders and executives in the industry quietly sold their shares and distanced themselves from their companies, replaced by foreign nationals who were out of the DOJ's reach. The industry became more anonymous, more shadowy. But it didn't stop. In fact, it kept growing, fueled by the dot-com bubble and an insatiable appetite from American consumers. The conviction of Jay Cohen wasn't the end of the war. It was just the end of the first battle. And for Senator Keel and his allies in Washington, it was all the proof they needed. The current laws weren't enough. They needed a bigger weapon, a law so comprehensive it could cripple the entire industry in one fell swoop. And as they went back to the drawing board to craft this new legislation, they found a powerful and unlikely new ally, an organization with immense resources and a vested interest in shutting down the online game for good: the National Football League. The National Football League seems almost counterintuitive. A league whose very existence thrives on the unpredictable outcome of a game, a league that sells drama and suspense week after week, was now standing shoulder to shoulder with moral crusaders to ban the very act of wagering on that suspense. To understand this alliance, you have to understand the NFL's greatest fear. And it wasn't losing money, it was losing trust. The league's commissioners, from Pete Rozelle to Paul Tagliabue, had a mantra they repeated like a sacred text: protect the integrity of the game. This wasn't just public relations fluff. It was the foundation of their entire billion-dollar empire. Fans had to believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that what they were watching on the field was a pure contest of skill and strategy, not a predetermined outcome influenced by outside money. History had taught them this lesson the hard way. The sports world was haunted by the ghosts of betting scandals past. The 1919 Black Sox, who threw the World Series, the college basketball point-shaving scandals of the 1950s. These events had left deep, permanent scars on the American psyche, demonstrating how quickly the public's love for a sport could curdle into cynicism and disgust if they suspected the game was fixed. The NFL looked at the rise of the internet not as an opportunity, but as an existential threat. Before, placing a sports bet was an inconvenient, often shady affair. You had to know a guy or travel to Las Vegas. It was a fringe activity, but the internet erased all of that friction. Suddenly, anyone with a dial-up modem and a credit card could place a bet on the point spread of a Dallas Cowboys game from their basement in Ohio. The league's nightmare scenario wasn't just about a star quarterback taking a dive for a payday. It was far more insidious. They feared a world where every single play would be viewed through a lens of suspicion. A dropped pass in the end zone? A questionable pass interference call from a referee? A last-second missed field goal? In a world of ubiquitous online betting, every one of these moments could ignite a firestorm of conspiracy theories. Fans would no longer blame a bad play on human error. They'd wonder if the player had money on the other team. They'd question if the referee had a stake in the outcome. Once that seed of doubt was planted, it would be impossible to remove. The trust would be gone. The product would be tainted. The entire enterprise could collapse. So the NFL went on the offensive. And they didn't go alone. They were quickly joined by the other major sports leagues: Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, and perhaps most powerfully the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA. The NCAA had an even more compelling argument. They weren't dealing with millionaire professional athletes. They were responsible for unpaid student athletes, some of whom were struggling financially and might be far more susceptible to the temptations of a bribe from a gambling syndicate. This coalition of sports leagues was the political cavalry that anti-gambling politicians had been dreaming of. They brought three things to the fight that had been sorely lacking: money, sophisticated lobbying power, and mainstream credibility. This was no longer just a niche moral issue being pushed by a few concerned congressmen. This was now about protecting America's pastime. It was about shielding college kids from corruption. It was about preserving the sanctity of Sunday afternoon football. The league's lobbyists descended on Capitol Hill, armed with polling data, talking points, and campaign contributions. They framed the issue perfectly for public consumption. They argued that unregulated offshore sportsbooks were a direct threat to the integrity of their games, and by extension, to a core piece of American culture. This new, powerful alliance breathed life back into the legislative efforts of Senator John Keel and Representative Jim Leach. Their previous attempts had stalled, but now they had the full-throated backing of some of the most powerful and popular brands in the country. They went back to work, drafting new versions of their anti-gambling bills. This time, the legislation was smarter, more focused. Learning from the debates over the Wire Act, they started to shift their focus away from the impossible task of policing every individual better. Instead, they began to zero in on the choke point of the entire industry, the money. They started asking a simple but brilliant question. How do these offshore casinos get their money from American customers, and how do they pay out winnings? The answer was through the U.S. financial system: credit cards, wire transfers, electronic checks. The new legislative strategy began to coalesce around the idea of making it illegal for banks and credit card companies to process those transactions. If you could cut off the flow of money, you could starve the beast. As this legislative battle was reigniting in Washington, a much larger technological and economic storm was brewing across the country: the dot-com bubble. The late 1990s were a period of wild, almost delirious optimism about the internet. Companies with no profits and flimsy business plans were achieving billion-dollar valuations overnight. It felt like a new digital gold rush, and the online gambling sites were right in the middle of it. This cultural moment had a dual effect on the gambling debate. On one hand, the explosive growth of the internet made the online casinos seem more powerful and inevitable than ever. They were raising millions in venture capital, advertising aggressively, and their logos were even showing up as sponsors on professional sports teams in other countries. They looked like the future. But on the other hand, the dot-com frenzy also created a deep-seated anxiety. To many Americans and lawmakers, the internet was starting to look like a lawless Wild West. It was a place where norms were being shattered, regulations were non-existent, and new unforeseen dangers could be lurking behind every hyperlink. Stories about online scams, illicit content, and a general sense of digital chaos filled the news. This growing techlash created a fertile political environment for anyone proposing to bring some law and order to the digital frontier. The Anti-Gambling Coalition masterfully tapped into this anxiety. They painted online casinos not as innovative tech companies, but as predatory offshore entities using this new technology to invade American homes, sidestep American laws, and exploit American citizens. Of course, there was a powerful counter-argument. A growing chorus of voices from the offshore industry, civil liberties groups, and free market advocates pushed back hard. They argued that any attempt to ban online gambling was a fool's errand. You can't ban a website that's hosted on a server in Antigua or Costa Rica. Trying to do so, they claimed, was an affront to personal freedom and a new form of prohibition that was doomed to fail. Their core argument was one of pragmatism. People are going to gamble online whether it's legal or not. Wouldn't it be better to legalize it, regulate it, and tax it? By doing so, you could implement consumer protections, ensure the games are fair, provide resources for problem gamblers, and generate billions of dollars in tax revenue. Driving it underground, they warned, would only empower actual criminals and leave consumers with zero recourse if they got cheated. For several years, from the late 90s into the early 2000s, these two powerful forces fought to a standstill. Every year, a new version of the Keel-Leach bill would be introduced in Congress. There would be hearings, passionate floor speeches, and intense backroom lobbying from both sides. The sports leagues and their conservative allies would talk about protecting kids and the integrity of the game. The gambling industry and its allies would talk about freedom, technology, and the impossibility of enforcement. And every year the bill would die. It would pass in one chamber but not the other. It would get bogged down in committee. It would get filibustered. The political will was just never quite strong enough to get it over the finish line. The tech world was moving too fast, and the legal and jurisdictional questions were just too complicated. It seemed like the internet was simply ungovernable. The Anti-Gambling Coalition was getting frustrated. They had the public sentiment, they had the powerful sports leagues, but they kept hitting a legislative brick wall. It became clear that a direct frontal assault wasn't working. If they were ever going to succeed, they needed a new strategy. They needed a way to get their legislation passed without having a big open fight about it. They needed a legislative Trojan horse. And in the fall of 2006, they found the perfect one. The Trojan horse was a piece of legislation called the SafePort Act. On the surface, it had absolutely nothing to do with gambling. Its full name was the Security and Accountability for Every Port Act, and it was a direct response to the lingering security fears of a post-9/11 America. It was designed to bolster security at the nation's seaports, to prevent nuclear materials from being smuggled into the country in shipping containers. It was a massive, critical, and most importantly, a must-pass bill. No politician in their right mind, just weeks before the 2006 midterm elections, was going to vote against protecting America's ports from a terrorist threat. It was political suicide to even consider it. And the anti-gambling proponents, led by Senator Bill Frist of Tennessee and Senator John Keel of Arizona, knew this. They had been trying for years to pass their own standalone bills, and for years they had failed. But now they saw their opening. They decided to take the entire text of their anti-internet gambling bill and attach it, like a parasite, to the body of the Safe Port Act. They wouldn't introduce it as a new law to be debated. They would slip it in as an amendment to a law that was already on a fast track to being passed. The move was as cynical as it was brilliant. It happened in the dead of night, literally. On September 29, 2006, with Congress rushing to adjourn for the upcoming elections, Senator Frist pushed the bill through. There was no real debate on the gambling provision. There were no committee hearings to discuss its potential economic impact. There were no expert witnesses called to testify about the technology or the industry. Most members of Congress who were voting on the massive port security bill likely had no idea that a provision that would upend a multi-billion-dollar global industry was even buried deep within its pages. They were voting for port security, but they were also voting for something else entirely. The House and Senate passed the combined bill, and on October 13, 2006, President George W. Bush signed the Safe Port Act into law. Tucked away inside as Title VIII was the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, or UIGEA. The Trojan horse had made it inside the gates. The industry and the millions of Americans who enjoy playing poker online were about to find out what was inside. So what did UIGEA actually do? This is one of the fussiest and most misunderstood pieces of legislation in modern American history. To this day, many people believe that UIGEA made it a federal crime for an individual to play poker or place a bet online. That is not what the law says. It never targeted the players directly. The architects of the law knew that trying to prosecute millions of individual citizens for playing a $10 poker tournament on their home computer was impossible. It would be a logistical and political nightmare. Instead, they went for a different strategy, a choke point strategy. They didn't make the act of playing illegal, they made the act of paying for it illegal. UIGEA's core function was to prohibit gambling businesses from knowingly accepting payments in connection with the participation of another person in a bet or wager that involves the use of the internet, and that is unlawful under any federal or state law. Let's break that down. It's a mouthful, but the target is clear. The law was aimed squarely at the financial institutions, the banks, the credit card companies, and the payment processors. It essentially told them, you are now legally responsible for blocking any and all transactions related to online gambling. It didn't define what unlawful internet gambling was. It vaguely deferred to other state and federal laws, creating a legal minefield. The goal was simple. If players can't get money onto the sites, and more importantly, if they can't get their winnings off the sites, the industry will wither and die. It's like trying to shut down a building not by arresting the people inside, but by ordering the utility companies to cut off the water and electricity. The effect was not gradual. It was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The moment President Bush signed the bill, shockwaves ripped through the global financial markets. Remember, many of the biggest online poker and gambling companies weren't shady, fly-by-night operations. They were massive, publicly traded corporations listed on the London Stock Exchange, with billions of dollars in market capitalization. Party Gaming, the parent company of the undisputed king of online poker, Party Poker, saw its stock price plummet by nearly 60% in a single day. The company, which just a year earlier had an initial public offering that valued it at nearly $9 billion, lost billions in value in a matter of hours. The same story played out for other publicly traded giants like 888 Holdings and Sportingbet. It was a bloodbath. The financial markets had delivered their verdict. The American online gambling gold rush was over. For the companies, the writing was on the wall. UIGEA made operating in the United States a toxic legal risk. They were now faced with a terrible choice. Defy the U.S. government and risk having their executives arrested and their entire business seized, or abandon the single most lucrative market in the world. For the publicly traded companies, the choice was obvious. They had a responsibility to their shareholders to operate legally. Within hours of the bill's passage, Party Poker announced it would immediately stop accepting wagers from players in the United States. It was a stunning move. Imagine if tomorrow, Google announced it was pulling its search engine out of America. That was the scale of this decision within the online poker world. Party Poker wasn't just a site. It was the industry for a huge number of players. And just like that, it was gone. Other publicly traded companies followed suit, one by one, announcing their withdrawal from the US market. For millions of American players, it was a moment of pure chaos and confusion. They woke up one morning to find they couldn't log into the sites where they had spent years playing, building communities, and in some cases earning a living. Their money, their bankrolls, were suddenly trapped on sites that no longer served them. While most of the reputable companies that left, like Party Poker, did eventually pay their American players back, the process was slow and nerve-wracking. The sense of stability was shattered. The US government and the bill's proponents declared victory. They had, in their view, protected the public and upheld moral values. They had cut the head off the snake. But what they had actually done was create a power vacuum. By forcing out the big public and relatively transparent companies, they had rolled out the red carpet for a new breed of operator. These were private companies, often based in more obscure jurisdictions, who looked at the new American legal landscape and saw not a risk, but an opportunity. They were willing to operate in the gray area, to find new and creative ways to process payments, and to take on the customers that Party Poker and others had just abandoned. The American online poker scene didn't die on October 13, 2006. It was just driven underground. The government hadn't ended the game. It had simply changed the players, replacing regulated, publicly owned corporations with a wild west of private operators. And in doing so, they had inadvertently set the stage for an even bigger, more dramatic and more devastating confrontation with the industry. An event that would become known to poker players around the world by two simple, chilling words: Black Friday. The years following the passage of the UIGEA were a strange and contradictory time for online poker in America. On one hand, the law was on the books. It was officially the policy of the United States government that financial institutions should not process transactions for illegal online gambling. Many publicly traded companies like Party Poker had immediately packed their bags and left the US market, unwilling to risk the wrath of the Department of Justice. But for those who stayed, business wasn't just good. It was booming. The departure of major competitors had created a vacuum, and two giants, PokerStars and Full Tilt Poker, rushed in to fill it. They, along with a smaller network called Sirius, which hosted sites like Absolute Poker and Ultimate Bet, now dominated the American market. To the average player, it felt like a golden age. The tournament prize pools were bigger than ever. Television was blanketed with commercials featuring celebrity poker pros, turning players like Chris Moneymaker, Phil Ivey, and Gus Hansen into household names. It felt mainstream, felt legitimate, it felt safe. The for all its bluster, seemed to be a law with no teeth. The poker sites had quickly devised clever, if legally dubious, workarounds. Since they couldn't have transactions coded as gambling, they worked with third-party payment processors who would disguise the deposits. A player might deposit $500 to Full Tilt Poker, but their credit card statement would show a charge for something innocuous, like a purchase from an online jewelry store or a golf equipment website. These payment processors created dozens, even hundreds, of shell companies for the sole purpose of miscoding these transactions. It was a complex and shadowy web of international finance, designed to circumvent a single American law. And for nearly 5 years it worked flawlessly. The entire industry was built on a shared, unspoken assumption that the US government, while disapproving, was ultimately more interested in targeting the banks than the poker sites themselves or the individual players. The poker companies operated from offshore havens, their servers located on the Isle of Man or in the Channel Islands. They believed this put them beyond the reach of US law enforcement. They were sponsoring NASCAR drivers, signing deals with major sports leagues, and behaving like any other major entertainment company. They were hiding in plain sight, their audacity a shield against scrutiny, but they had profoundly miscalculated. They underestimated the tenacity and the reach of one of the most powerful law enforcement bodies in the world, the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. While poker players saw a game, the prosecutors at the SDNY saw something else entirely. They saw a multi-billion-dollar illegal enterprise, brazenly violating federal law, and the way the sites were moving money wasn't just a clever workaround. In the eyes of the federal government, it was bank fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering on a colossal scale. The investigation was methodical and silent. For years, federal agents built their case. They tracked the flow of money. They identified the payment processors. They found cooperative witnesses, including one Utah banker named John Campos, whose small, struggling bank had been allegedly co-opted by the poker sites to process billions of dollars in illegal transactions. The government wasn't just looking at the UIGEA violation, They were building a much larger, much more serious case under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO Act, the same powerful statute used to dismantle the mafia. The poker world remained blissfully unaware. Players continued to grind, depositing and withdrawing, building their bankrolls and chasing their dreams. April 15, 2011 started like any other Friday. For most Americans, it was tax day, a day of deadlines and paperwork. For online poker players, it was the start of the weekend, a time for the biggest weekly tournaments with life-changing money on the line. And then it happened. Players across the country woke up, brewed their coffee, and sat down at their computers to log into PokerStars or Full Tilt. But instead of the familiar digital felt and the sound of shuffling chips, they were met with a stark, terrifying image. The website had been seized. In its place was the seal of the Department of Justice and the emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A notice declared that the domain name had been seized by the FBI pursuant to a warrant obtained for violations of U.S. federal law, including the operation of an illegal gambling business and conspiracy to commit bank fraud and money laundering. The news spread through the community like a shockwave. It was instantaneous and devastating. Forums and social media lit up with panic and disbelief. Was this real? Was this a hack? It couldn't be. The giants had been slain. In a single coordinated action, the Department of Justice had unsealed a 52-page indictment against 11 key individuals, including the founders of PokerStars, Full Tilt Poker, and Absolute Poker. The charges were staggering. The government was seeking to recover $3 billion in forfeitures from the companies. For the players, the legal details were secondary to a much more immediate and terrifying reality. Their money was gone. The sites were shut down. The cashiers were inaccessible. Every dollar that every American player had stored on those sites, their winnings, their savings, their entire livelihoods, was frozen, locked away in a legal battle between offshore companies and the U.S. government. For tens of thousands of people, this wasn't just a hobby. It was their profession. Bankrolls ranging from a few $100s to millions were now in limbo. The panic was real and profound. The indictment laid bare the inner workings of the payment processing schemes the sites had used. It detailed how they had allegedly lied to and deceived U.S. banks, how they had conspired with payment processors to disguise transactions, and even how they had allegedly attempted to purchase a controlling interest in a struggling American bank to process their own funds. The government's message was clear. This was not about the morality of poker. This was about the integrity of the United States financial system. In the chaotic days that followed, a crucial difference between the major sites began to emerge. PokerStars, the largest site in the world, quickly entered into an agreement with the Department of Justice. They did not admit to criminal wrongdoing, but they agreed to forfeit a massive sum of money to the government, and in exchange, they were allowed to regain their domain name for the purpose of one critical task: cashing out their American players. Within weeks, PokerStars began the process of returning every single cent owed to its U.S. customer base. They proved that player funds had been segregated and were safe, cementing their reputation for reliability even in the face of a catastrophe. But at Full Tilt Poker, there was only silence. Days turned into weeks. The company, which had built its brand on the names and faces of the world's most famous poker pros, issued vague and non-committal press releases. Players who tried to cash out were met with error messages. The money wasn't coming. The silence was deafening, and a horrifying suspicion began to creep into the minds of the poker community. PokerStars had the money to pay its players. Why didn't Full Tilt? The company was supposed to be holding hundreds of millions of dollars in player deposits. Where was it? The truth, when it finally came to light, would be far worse than anyone could have possibly imagined, revealing a scandal of mismanagement and deceit that would shatter the industry's foundations and prove that the real crime wasn't just what happened on Black Friday, but what had been happening behind closed doors for years. The indictment unsealed on Black Friday was a bombshell, but the aftershocks revealed something far more sinister. While PokerStars and Absolute Poker were accused of illegal payment processing, the case against Full Tilt Poker went into a different stratosphere. It wasn't just about how they moved money, it was about money that simply wasn't there. As investigators peeled back the layers of Full Tilt's operations, they uncovered a financial black hole. The company that had branded itself as by the players for the players, led by a roster of the most famous and respected poker professionals in the world, was, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, nothing more than a global Ponzi scheme. This wasn't hyperbole from a zealous prosecutor. This was the cold, calculated reality of their business model. For years, Full Tilt Poker had been operating with a massive shortfall. The numbers on the screen, the balances that players saw in their accounts, were a fiction. When a player cashed out, they weren't being paid from their own deposited funds. They were being paid with money from new players who were just depositing. It was a classic pyramid structure, a digital house of cards that depended on a constant inflow of new cash to stay upright. As long as more money was coming in than going out, the illusion could be maintained. But Black Friday cut off that lifeline. By severing the company's access to the U.S. market, the Department of Justice had unknowingly kicked out the foundation, and the entire edifice came crashing down. The scale of the fraud was breathtaking. Court documents revealed that by March 31, 2011, just 2 weeks before the shutdown, Full Tilt owed approximately $390 million to players around the world. Of that, $150 million was owed to players in the United States. The problem? The company had only about $60 million in its bank accounts. There was a $330 million hole. The money was gone. So where did it go? It went into the pockets of the owners. The board of directors, which included poker legends Howard Lederer, Chris "Jesus" Ferguson, and Ray First, along with CEO Ray Bitar, had allegedly paid themselves over $444 million from player funds since 2007. They were treating the company's accounts, filled with money that belonged to their customers, as their personal piggy bank. While hundreds of thousands of players believed their money was safe and segregated, the owners were allegedly buying multi-million-dollar homes, luxury cars, and funding lavish lifestyles. Chris Ferguson, the stoic, long-haired academic of the poker world, famous for his PhD in computer science from UCLA, had allegedly received at least $25 million, with court filings suggesting the number could be as high as $85 million. Howard Lederer, the professor, another celebrated and strategic mind, had allegedly taken over $42 million. The betrayal felt by the poker community was profound. These weren't anonymous, faceless executives. These were the heroes of the game. Players had watched them on television, read their strategy books, and joined Full Tilt specifically because they trusted these icons to run an honest operation. The scandal shattered that trust completely. It revealed that the very people who presented themselves as guardians of the game were allegedly its most egregious plunderers. In the immediate aftermath of Black Friday, the contrast between the major sites was stark. PokerStars, the industry leader, quickly reached an agreement with the Department of Justice. They did not admit to wrongdoing, but they agreed to forfeit $731 million to the government. Crucially, as part of this deal, PokerStars took on the responsibility of repaying all of Full Tilt Poker's international players, a sum of $184 million. They also ensured their own American players were paid back every cent they had on the site. Their ability to do this immediately proved that, unlike Full Tilt, they had kept player funds segregated and had the capital to cover all balances. This act, while part of a legal settlement, went a long way in salvaging their reputation in the global community. Full Tilt, on the other hand, was insolvent. It was a zombie company. For months, players outside the US were in limbo, while American players were left with seemingly worthless account balances. Their money was gone with no clear path to recovery. The online forums, once filled with strategy discussions and bad beat stories, were now flooded with desperate pleas from people whose life savings had vanished. There were stories of professional players who were now broke, of students who had lost their tuition money, and of casual players who had lost nest eggs they couldn't afford to lose. The dream of online poker had become a waking nightmare. The legal hammer came down hard on the individuals involved. The DOJ amended its civil complaint to include Lederer and Ferguson, seeking the forfeiture of their ill-gotten gains. CEO Ray Bitar, who had become the public face of the company's collapse, eventually surrendered to U.S. authorities in 2012. He faced charges that could have sent him to prison for the rest of his life. However, his case took an unexpected turn. Bitar was in dire need of a heart transplant and was reportedly given only a small chance of survival. In a controversial decision, he struck a plea deal, admitting to criminal charges, forfeiting his assets, but avoiding any prison time due to his critical health condition. To many in the poker community, it felt like he had escaped justice. Howard Lederer and Chris Ferguson also reached civil settlements with the government. Lederer forfeited millions in assets, including property and luxury cars, without admitting to wrongdoing. Ferguson did the same, agreeing to turn over millions but also sidestepping any admission of guilt. For years, they became pariahs in the poker world, symbols of the ultimate betrayal of trust. For the hundreds of thousands of American victims, the question remained: would they ever see their money again? The answer would come from an unlikely source: the settlement money paid by poker stars. The Department of Justice announced that a portion of the $731 million forfeiture would be used to create a remission fund to compensate the U.S. players of Full Tilt Poker. It was a glimmer of hope, but the process would be a marathon, not a sprint. A third-party claims administrator, the Garden City Group, was appointed to oversee the monumental task of verifying hundreds of thousands of claims and distributing the funds. The process dragged on for years, a slow bureaucratic grind that tested the patience of the victims. The first wave of payments didn't go out until early 2014, nearly 3 years after Black Friday. The final payments took even longer. The Full Tilt Poker scandal was more than just a financial crime. It was a fundamental turning point in the history of online gambling in America. It was the ultimate cautionary tale. The Wild West era, where offshore companies operated with impunity and without oversight, had ended in catastrophic failure. The scandal demonstrated, in the most painful way possible, the absolute necessity of regulation. Without government licensing, strict auditing requirements, and mandated segregation of player funds, customers were completely vulnerable. The argument that the industry could effectively police itself was now laughable. The very icons who were meant to be the policemen were the ones who had robbed the bank. This colossal failure, this breach of trust that shook the entire online world, paradoxically became the single most powerful argument for the one thing the industry had fought against for over a decade: a legal, licensed, and regulated online gambling market within the United States. The question was no longer if it should happen, but how, and who would be brave enough to lead the way out of the ashes. The answer, it turned out, wouldn't come from a single hero, but from a quiet, almost bureaucratic reversal buried deep within the Department of Justice. While the industry was still reeling from Black Friday, state governments, particularly those with struggling budgets and existing gambling infrastructure, were asking a very different question. They weren't asking how to shut down online gambling, they were asking how to tax it. States like Illinois and New York had approached the DOJ seeking clarity. They wanted to sell lottery tickets online, but were terrified of violating the Wire Act. The very law that had been used as a sledgehammer against online poker was now a roadblock to state-run revenue streams. So in late December of 2011, just 8 months after Black Friday, the DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel issued a formal opinion. It was a document that would once again change everything. For years, the DOJ had maintained that the 1961 Wire Act applied to all forms of betting. But this new opinion, a stunning reversal, stated that the Wire Act's prohibitions were limited only to sports betting. It didn't apply to lotteries, casino games, or most importantly, online poker. It wasn't a repeal. It wasn't a new law passed by Congress. It was a reinterpretation, a quiet clarification that landed like a thunderclap. The federal government was essentially saying, "We're only concerned with sports betting. Everything else? That's up to the states to decide for themselves." The door that had been slammed shut and bolted on Black Friday had just been unlocked. The federal boogeyman was gone. Now the battle would move from Washington, D.C. to the state houses of Trenton, Carson City, and Dover. The first state to walk through that door was, unsurprisingly, Nevada. The Silver State had legalized land-based gambling decades before anyone else. It was in their DNA. They saw the potential of online poker not just as a business, but as a way to reassert their dominance as the gambling capital of America. In February 2013, Governor Brian Sandoval signed Assembly Bill 114 into law, officially authorizing online poker within state lines. But Nevada's approach was cautious, almost surgical. They didn't legalize a full suite of online casino games like slots or blackjack. It was poker only. The logic was simple. Poker was seen as a game of skill, more palatable to the public and less threatening to their colossal brick-and-mortar casino industry. They didn't want people sitting on their couches in Reno playing digital slots instead of visiting the Bellagio. They wanted to leverage their world-famous poker brands, like the World Series of Poker, and create a digital footprint that complemented their physical one. On April 30, 2013, Ultimate Poker dealt the first hand of legal, regulated online poker in the United States. The era of prohibition was officially over. While Nevada was the first to launch, they weren't the only ones racing to the finish line. In a move that surprised many, the tiny state of Delaware actually beat Nevada to the punch in terms of legislation. Delaware, known as the first state for being the first to ratify the U.S. Constitution, lived up to its nickname. In June of 2012, Governor Jack Markell signed the Delaware Gaming Competitiveness Act. and Delaware went all in. Unlike Nevada's poker-only model, Delaware authorized a full online casino experience. Poker, blackjack, slots, roulette, the works. Their motivation was starkly different. Delaware didn't have a Las Vegas to protect. They had a state lottery and 3 racetrack casinos, known as racinos, that were struggling to compete with larger casinos in neighboring states like Pennsylvania and Maryland. For Delaware, online gambling wasn't a brand extension. It was a defensive measure, a desperate attempt to modernize and capture revenue that was bleeding across state lines. They officially went live in November 2013, becoming the first state to offer a complete online casino product. But the real prize, the market everyone was watching, was New Jersey. With a population of nearly 9 million people, more than 10 times that of Delaware and 3 times that of Nevada, and a teetering casino empire in Atlantic City, the Garden State had the most to gain and the most to lose. The fight to legalize online gambling in New Jersey was a political drama in its own right, centered around its larger-than-life governor, Chris Christie. Christie, a former U.S. attorney, had a complex relationship with the issue. Initially, he was a staunch opponent. In 2011, he vetoed an online gambling bill, citing constitutional concerns about whether it expanded gambling outside of Atlantic City. But the pressure was immense. Atlantic City, once the glittering jewel of the East Coast, was decaying. Casinos were closing, thousands of jobs were being lost, and the city's tax base was evaporating. The state needed a lifeline. The legislature went back to the drawing board, crafting a new bill that addressed Christie's concerns. It mandated that all the computer servers running the online games had to be physically located within the licensed casinos in Atlantic City. This was the legal linchpin, the argument that online gambling wasn't an expansion, but merely a new way for customers to patronize the existing Atlantic City casinos. After another round of intense negotiations and a conditional veto that tightened regulations, Christie finally signed the bill into law in February 2013. The launch in November 2013 was a monumental event. Global gaming giants, who had been locked out of the U.S. for years, partnered with Atlantic City casinos to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the new market. It was a technological marvel. To comply with the law, companies had to develop sophisticated geofencing technology. This software used a combination of Wi-Fi signals, GPS, and cell tower triangulation to ensure, with near-perfect accuracy, that a player was physically located within the borders of New Jersey. If you were on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River, you could play. If you stepped onto the bridge into Pennsylvania, the software would instantly lock you out. This new legal world was a far cry from the Wild West days of the early 2000s. Every operator was licensed. Every game was tested for fairness by the Division of Gaming Enforcement. There were robust protections for responsible gaming and tools to prevent underage access. The money was taxed, and that tax revenue was earmarked to help revitalize Atlantic City. However, the initial results were not the overnight gold rush that some had predicted. The early revenue numbers in all 3 states, Nevada, Delaware, and New Jersey, were modest. There were payment processing issues as many major banks, still spooked by the UIGEA, were reluctant to handle gambling transactions. Public awareness was low. Many people simply didn't know it was legal, or they were skeptical, accustomed to a decade of warnings about the dangers of offshore sites. The ring-fenced nature of the markets also presented a major challenge, especially for poker. Poker thrives on liquidity, having a large number of players online at any given time to ensure games are always running at various stakes. Nevada, with its small population, struggled to maintain a critical mass of players. Delaware's market was even smaller, practically a ghost town. Even New Jersey, the largest market, found it difficult to replicate the massive player pools of the old global sites. The pioneers had successfully established beachheads. They had proven that regulated online gambling could work safely and securely. But they quickly realized that if this new industry was going to survive, let alone thrive, they couldn't go it alone. The states, once competitors in a race to legalize, now had to learn how to cooperate. They needed to tear down the digital walls they had so carefully constructed around their borders, and find a way to connect their small, isolated islands of players into a much larger, more powerful network. The next great legal battle would be over creating these interstate highways, a challenge that would set the stage for the biggest fight of all: the war against the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. The Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, or PASPA, wasn't just another law. It was a fortress. Enacted in 1992, it was championed by a former New York Knick, Senator Bill Bradley, who argued that state-sponsored sports betting would threaten the integrity of the games themselves. The major sports leagues, the NFL, NBA, MLB, and NHL, all threw their colossal weight behind it. They painted a picture of a world where every missed field goal, every dropped pass, would be viewed through a lens of suspicion. Was the player paid to throw the game? Was the fix in? PASPA was their shield, a federal law that effectively outlawed sports betting nationwide. It did, however, carve out a few exceptions. States that already had some form of sports wagering were grandfathered in. Nevada, with its sprawling sportsbooks, was the most obvious beneficiary. Oregon, Delaware, and Montana had limited sports lotteries, and were also allowed to continue. The law even gave one other state a one-year window to legalize sports betting if it chose. New Jersey, home to the struggling casino hub of Atlantic City. But in 1993, with its casinos still focused on slot machines and table games, New Jersey let the deadline pass. The window slammed shut, and for nearly 2 decades, the fortress of PASPA stood unchallenged. The message from the federal government and the powerful sports leagues was clear. The book on sports betting is closed. But then the ground began to shift. The world that PASPA was built for, a world of land-based casinos and local bookies, was vanishing. The internet had changed everything. Billions of dollars were flowing out of the country to offshore, unregulated betting sites. The league's argument about integrity began to ring hollow when anyone with a smartphone could place a bet with an anonymous bookmaker in Costa Rica. The money was being wagered anyway, it just wasn't being taxed, regulated, or monitored. And in New Jersey, desperation was a powerful motivator. Atlantic City, once the glittering jewel of the East Coast, was fading. Casinos were closing. Jobs were disappearing. The state needed a new source of revenue, a new way to bring people back. And they looked at the one massive untapped market that PASPA had locked away. In 2011, New Jersey voters went to the polls and overwhelmingly approved a state constitutional amendment to legalize sports betting. The people had spoken. The governor, Chris Christie, a brash and confrontational former prosecutor, was ready for a fight. He signed the legislation, directly challenging the 20-year-old federal ban. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The 4 major professional sports leagues, plus the NCAA, joined forces and sued the state of New Jersey. It was a legal Goliath descending on a state that dared to question its authority. Their argument was simple and on its face unassailable. PASPA is the law of the land. It's a federal statute, and under the supremacy clause of the Constitution, federal law trumps state law. New Jersey's attempt to legalize sports betting was, they argued, a clear violation. And the courts agreed. The district court sided with the leagues. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the leagues. New Jersey had charged the fortress head-on, and been thrown back decisively. The case seemed over. But New Jersey wasn't done. They had a different idea. A more subtle and far more profound legal argument. They decided that if they couldn't knock down the fortress, maybe they could find a secret passage, a flaw in its very foundation. Their new strategy wasn't about the right to legalize sports betting. It was about a fundamental principle of American government, states' rights. Their lawyers went back to the drawing board and crafted a new law. This time, instead of affirmatively legalizing sports betting, the law simply repealed New Jersey's own state-level prohibitions on it, but only at casinos and racetracks. It was a clever distinction. The state wasn't saying sports betting is legal. It was saying we, the state of New Jersey, will no longer use our resources to stop it from happening in these specific places. The leagues, of course, sued again. And again, New Jersey lost in the lower courts. The legal experts, the court watchers, the pundits, almost everyone believed it was a lost cause, a political stunt. But New Jersey's lawyers were aiming for a much bigger target than the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. They were aiming for the Supreme Court. And their argument was based on a powerful, if somewhat obscure, constitutional doctrine, anti-commandeering. Rooted in the 10th Amendment, which reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states, the anti-commandeering doctrine says that Congress can't just order states to do its bidding. It can't commandeer the state's legislative machinery and force it to enforce a federal program. New Jersey's argument was that PASPA did exactly that. It wasn't a federal ban on individuals placing bets. It was a federal ban on states choosing to repeal their own laws. The federal government, they argued, was forcing New Jersey to keep a law on its books that its own voters and legislature wanted to get rid of. It was turning the state of New Jersey into a puppet of the federal government, forced to carry out Congress's will. This, they claimed, was a violation of the very structure of American federalism. It was a brilliant, high-risk legal gambit. They were asking the Supreme Court to look past the issue of gambling and see a fundamental constitutional crisis. For years, they fought their way up the legal ladder, losing at every single step. It cost the state millions of dollars. It looked like a fool's errand, but they kept appealing, petitioning the highest court in the land to hear their case. And then, in June of 2017, the impossible happened. The Supreme Court of the United States announced it would hear the case of Murphy v. National Collegiate Athletic Association. The court receives over 7,000 petitions a year and agrees to hear only about 100. The fact that they took the case at all sent shockwaves through the legal and sports worlds. It meant that at least 4 of the 9 justices saw something compelling in New Jersey state's rights argument. The long shot was suddenly in the running. The fortress of PASPA, once thought to be impenetrable, now had a crack in its foundation. The stage was set for one of the most significant Supreme Court battles in a generation. On one side stood the combined power of the federal government and every major sports league in the nation, arguing for integrity, uniformity, and the supremacy of federal law. On the other side stood a single state, armed with a radical constitutional theory, fighting for its economic life and the principle of self-governance. The oral arguments were a masterclass in legal theory, a high-stakes debate over the very nature of power in America. The questions from the justices were sharp, probing the limits of federal authority. Could Congress tell a state it couldn't repeal a law against murder? Of course not. So why was a law against sports betting any different? The fate of a $100 billion industry, the future of sports in America, and a core question of constitutional law all rested on the decision of 9 justices. The fight was over, and the nation held its breath, waiting for the verdict. On May 14, 2018, the silence broke. In a landmark 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. PASPA was dead. The court's reasoning was a masterclass in constitutional law, centered on a principle known as the anti-commandeering doctrine. Justice Samuel Alito, writing for the majority, argued that the U.S. Constitution does not permit Congress to commandeer the legislative processes of the states by directly compelling them to enact and enforce a federal regulatory program. In simple terms, the federal government can pass its own laws, but it can't force states to be its puppets. It can't order a state to keep a law on its books, or in this case, to maintain a prohibition. PASPA was telling states what they couldn't do. They couldn't authorize sports betting. The Supreme Court saw this not as a regulation of commerce, but as a direct infringement on state sovereignty, a violation of the 10th Amendment. The decision didn't legalize sports betting across America. It did something far more profound. It tossed the ball back to the states, declaring that each one had the right to decide for itself. The floodgates didn't just open, they were blown off their hinges. What followed was a state-by-state gold rush, a frantic legislative scramble unlike anything seen since the end of Prohibition. New Jersey, having fought the lonely battle for years, was first out of the gate, taking its first legal sports bet less than a month after the ruling. Delaware, which had a limited sports lottery, quickly expanded. They were followed by a cascade of others: Mississippi, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. The corporate landscape transformed overnight. The daily fantasy sports giants DraftKings and FanDuel, who had spent years arguing they weren't gambling, pivoted with breathtaking speed. They leveraged their massive user bases and brand recognition to become the dominant forces in the new legal sports betting market. Meanwhile, European bookmaking titans, companies that had operated in mature legal markets for decades, partnered with American casino conglomerates. Suddenly, names like MGM, Caesars, and Penn National were not just casino brands. They were sports betting empires. For the average American, the change was impossible to ignore. A wall of advertising descended upon the country. Every commercial break during a football game, every podcast, every billboard seemed to feature a celebrity telling you to download an app and place a bet. Promotional offers of risk-free bets and deposit matches became the new currency of customer acquisition in a hyper-competitive market. The leagues, once the staunchest opponents of sports betting, did a complete 180. They went from fighting legalization in court to signing multi-million-dollar deals, making sportsbooks their official betting partners. The very language of sports broadcasting began to change, with commentators openly discussing betting lines, odds, and prop bets as part of the normal analysis of the game. And while sports betting grabbed all the headlines, its legalization created a crucial opening for the other, often more lucrative, forms of online gambling. States like Pennsylvania and Michigan, when drafting their sports betting bills, had the foresight to include provisions for online casinos and poker. They saw the potential tax revenue and figured, if we're going to regulate one, we might as well regulate them all. This led to the quiet but steady growth of iGaming, where users could play digital slots, blackjack, and roulette from their phones. This was the true realization of the dream for online gambling proponents. A full-service, regulated digital casino available in the palm of your hand. Today, the United States is a patchwork quilt of gambling laws. A map of the country shows a complex mosaic of legal, illegal, and restricted states. A bet that is perfectly legal in New Jersey could lead to a felony charge just across the river in New York, depending on the current legislative session. A person can drive from a state with a dozen competing sports betting apps, through a state where only a state-run lottery app is allowed, and into a state like Utah, where all forms of gambling remain staunchly prohibited. The biggest prizes, the massive populations of California, Texas, and Florida, remain on the sidelines, locked in complex political battles involving tribal gaming compacts, powerful local interests, and lingering moral opposition. Yet, even in this new era of legalization, the ghosts of the past remain. The Wire Act of 1961, the law that started this whole saga, is still on the books, and its interpretation is still a source of contention. In 2018, the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel reversed the Obama-era opinion, once again suggesting the act could apply to all forms of interstate gambling, not just sports betting. This threw the burgeoning online poker and casino industries into a state of uncertainty, threatening the interstate compacts that allowed players from Nevada, New Jersey, and Delaware to compete against each other. The issue has been bouncing through the courts ever since, a reminder that the legal foundation is still settling. Furthermore, this rapid expansion has brought a critical challenge to the forefront: responsible gaming. With the convenience of placing a bet now reduced to a few taps on a screen, concerns over problem gambling have intensified. In response, states and operators are implementing new safeguards, tools for setting deposit and time limits, self-exclusion lists that apply across all platforms, and more prominent access to help and support. The debate is no longer if people should be allowed to gamble online, but how to ensure it's done in a way that minimizes harm. And so, our century-long journey comes to a close. We've traveled from backroom bookies and smoky saloons to the glittering palaces of Las Vegas. We've seen the mob build an empire and the federal government tear it down. We watched a kid from Tennessee win the World Series of Poker and ignite a global phenomenon from his computer, only to see it all come crashing down on Black Friday. We followed a legal battle over a single industry that escalated into a fundamental debate about the very nature of American federalism. The history of online gambling laws in the United States is more than a story about betting. It's a story about technology outrunning legislation. It's a story of personal freedom clashing with government control. It's a reflection of America's complicated, often contradictory, relationship with risk, morality, and money. From a desperate attempt to fund the Revolutionary War with the lottery, to a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded industry advertised during the Super Bowl, the game has constantly evolved. The laws have been written and rewritten, the battles won and lost, but the fundamental human impulse to take a chance on an uncertain outcome remains. The game itself never really ends. It just changes, waiting for the next hand to be dealt.